I'd actually like to introduce our first tool out of our toolkit. And it relates directly to what we're talking about here with the Strategist Challenge. And that's the idea of a SWOT analysis. SWOT is an acronym that stands for Strengths, Weaknesses, Opportunities, and Threats. This is, in many ways, the granddaddy of strategy and strategic analysis here. It goes back, roots about 50 years or so. What I like about SWOT analysis, despite its simplicity, is it highlights these two elements that I was just discussing: the internal firm capabilities and the external competitive environment. Once again, it is the interplay between those that ultimately decides whether a strategy is successful or not. So a SWOT analysis often is just portrayed as a 2x2, as you see on the screen, and you see bullet points that you can put between each of these to kind of illustrate the various strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Where we're going for a number of the other lectures is to basically fill in these blocks. We'll think a little more rigorously of how we think about opportunities and threats and strengths and weaknesses. But SWOT analysis, once again, is a nice overarching framework for organizing our thoughts about the competitive situation that a firm finds themselves in. Let me add two more tools to our toolkits. These are classic tools, really foundational tools in any strategist toolkit. The first is the idea of, very simply, a competitor analysis. We haven't talked about this in the past. This is the idea of simply going out and collecting competitive intelligence on your competitors and deriving a number of things about them. One, just simply performance metrics. How are they doing profitability? What are their revenues? What's their market share and the like, and to the extent you can collect such data. What are their capabilities? Back to our capabilities analysis idea. It's important to know that for yourself in this little chart, the focal firm, but you want to know that about your competitors as well. Are they able to do what you do, or do they do things in a slightly different way? This question about values. What's your objective function? What's your values here as a firm? How do they differ? And how does that influence ultimately your strategic position? And that gets us to our fourth column here, your strategy for each of these competitors. Now, competitor analysis is deceptively simple. Clearly, one of the greatest challenges in doing competitor analysis is simply identifying who are our relevant competitors. Even defining what our industry is can sometimes be very, very challenging. How do we define this? I encourage you to all think about strategic groups. If you look out over the landscape, a competitive landscape, you can often identify groups of firms that seem to be more relevant to you than others. And then by grouping them in that way, you can then prioritize which ones you should think about first. So imagine if you're Porsche. How useful or important is it for you to Porsche to do benchmarking and understanding what Kia is doing? Though you're both in the auto industry, you clearly are at very different places within that industry, and it's probably less important for you to put emphasis on Kia compared to perhaps BMW or other small manufacturers like Maserati or Lamborghini and the like. So once again, figure out what your industry segment, who your competitors are, but first start with this idea of strategic groups. The second tool I'd like to briefly introduce here is this idea of an environmental analysis. Environmental analysis is sometimes referred to as an environmental scan. It can take many different forms. The basic idea is to fire in your brain a set of topics that you need to think through for the industry. So here I present 6 topics that I think are useful and cover a wide space that you'd want to consider. Demographic trends. What's happening in the market? What's happening in terms of your customer base over time here, and how's that going to influence the industry? Social cultural influences. Is this an industry, let's take the beer industry, in which there are social cultural trends that are against binge drinking or drinking too much in certain circumstances that's going to lower demand. What are those influences and how is it impacting your industry? Clearly, for many industries, technological developments. How are these technologies evolving? We talked quite a bit about that in terms of competitive dynamics in our last session. Macroeconomic impacts. Is this an industry that is susceptible to the business cycle? What happens if we're in a recession? What happens if we're in a growth period to this industry? Political legal pressures. Lots of ways in which the broader political legal system will influence the behavior and the opportunity set within an industry. What are those potential constraints and opportunities? And then finally, global trade issues. Is this a global market? Do we see competition here going across boundaries? What are some of the issues in global trade that might impact the industry? So let me end here with a series of bullets highlighting some of the lessons that I hope you take away from this first introductory short lecture here. First, we can represent a business's strategy in its mission, plan, and actions. When we're trying to characterize it, think of those three elements in trying to characterize what the firm does and how they're positioning themselves strategically. Introduce this idea of strategic analysis and particularly position it as a useful way for assessing the viability of a business strategy, whether it is a good strategy or not. Highlight the idea that strategic analysis is not just the purview of the CEO. In fact, that strategic analysis is useful to any number of different individuals, including financial analysts, management consultants, entrepreneurs, even those who wish to influence the business in other directions from outside of that firm. And then finally, and most importantly today, I want you to remember that the strategist's challenge is to balance between values, opportunities, and capabilities. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is identify desirable competitive positions that create and sustain value. Thank you very much.